Okay, so, it seems like everywhere you turn lately, everyone's talking about the Federal Reserve and inflation.
Yeah.
And it can get really overwhelming
Right.
to figure out, what does it all really mean?
Exactly.
So that's why we're doing this deep dive today.
I love it.
Looking at a bunch of the recent back and forth about how the Fed is dealing with these, rising prices that everyone's feeling.
Absolutely. And you've given me a really interesting mix of stuff to look at today.
Oh, good.
We've got, a YouTube creator kind of giving like the big picture take. We've got some news articles that are breaking down what economists are saying.
Okay.
And we've even got like, a little window into Main Street USA on Reddit, seeing what regular people are saying.
What they're thinking.
Exactly. And, our goal today is to cut through all the noise and help you understand like what's at the heart of what people are arguing about. Especially when it comes to like how the Fed is talking about where they think inflation is headed next.
All right, so let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
One of the phrases that I kept seeing over and over again in a lot of these sources was from Richmond Fed President Tom Barkin.
Okay.
And he said that inflation expectations have, quote, loosened, not de-anchored, end quote.
Okay.
Now, that just sounds like some very specific wording.
It is, yeah.
So what's the difference between those two ideas?
Well, what's so interesting about that distinction to me is what it suggests about, like, the Fed's confidence, right? So loosened kind of implies, like, a little bit of give, right? Like, people might be expecting some, price swings. Yeah. But they still fundamentally believe that the Fed is going to get inflation back down to its target, Think of it like, letting out some slack on a fishing line. Okay. The fish can move around a bit, but it's still tethered. De-anchored, on the other hand, that suggests that the connection's totally broken. Right. People no longer trust that the Fed can or will control inflation, Yeah,
like they've lost control of the situation.
Totally. Yeah. It's like the runaway train.
That makes total sense. And, what's interesting is it's not just economists who are, like, parsing this language. There was this really good analogy on Reddit.
Oh, yeah.
That I thought captured this perfectly.
Oh, I love it.
And someone compared it to a boat and its anchor. Okay. So if the anchor line is loosened, the boat can drift a bit, but it's still, anchored in place. Right. But if the line is cut, the boat is just going to be carried away by the current. Yep. And in our case, the current is rising prices.
Exactly. Yeah, and that really kind of like...
It hits home.
It hits home. It makes it so real.
It does, yeah.
Because that's a really clear, everyday comparison. And I think it shows how people are trying to wrap their heads around, what these economic terms actually mean in their lives.
For sure.
Yeah.
Now, not everyone agrees with how the Fed is,
they're framing this.
Describing this situation.
Yeah.
We saw economist Craig Shapiro quoted in a couple of these news articles, and he used a pretty strong word.
He did?
He said gaslighting.
Gaslighting. Wow.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah.
So what's at the core of his argument? Right. Why does he think the Fed's language is misleading?
So Shapiro's perspective, as we saw in those articles, is that by kind of introducing this idea of loosened expectations, the Fed is trying to downplay the situation. Right. He thinks that they want the public to think that everything is still reasonably under control, even if, like, the underlying reality of inflation feels very different to people on the ground. Right. So it's about managing public perception, maybe without fully addressing the root causes of what's going on.
And this brings up like a really crucial point.
What's that?
This idea of trust.
Yeah.
One of the news articles that we were looking at really highlighted this link between greater public trust in the Fed and lower inflation expectations.
Okay.
And they said it also reduces economic uncertainty.
Interesting.
So if people feel like they're not getting the full story, what could that actually mean in the real world?
So let's connect this to your daily life.
Yeah.
A breakdown in that trust can have some pretty big effects. So as the article suggested, if people lose faith in the Fed's ability to control prices, they might start acting differently.
In what way?
Well, businesses, for example, could raise prices even faster, anticipating that inflation is just going to keep going up. Right. And you, as a consumer, might be more inclined to just buy things now
Yeah.
Rather than waiting, because you're worried that prices are just going to be higher.
Exactly. I'd rather just buy the thing now, even if I don't really need it.
Exactly. And that shift in behavior can actually end up fueling even higher inflation.
Oh, wow.
Which makes the Fed's job even harder.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost?
Kind of, yeah. It's like this vicious cycle that gets kicked off.
Yeah. And we were talking about, like, my day-to-day expenses, but it's not just, my wallet.
Right.
That could be affected.
Yeah.
This article also talked about how, like, financial markets could become more unstable.
Oh, yeah.
If that trust erodes.
So investors, they rely on the Fed's credibility and predictability when they're making decisions. So if they start to get unsure about the Fed's commitment to actually tackling inflation, or even their ability to just communicate honestly,
right,
that can lead to, more volatility, more uncertainty in the markets, which can have like these broader economic consequences.
It can kind of spiral out of control.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's go to Reddit.
All right, let's see what people are saying.
And look at what people were talking about there.
Yeah.
And, there was definitely a lot of skepticism.
Okay.
One user pointed out this, like, big difference between the official inflation numbers that we hear about and their own personal experience.
Right.
And they used the example of, like, how much the price of a Forerunner has gone up.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And, it makes you wonder... Are the numbers that we're hearing really reflecting, like, what people are actually seeing and experiencing?
Right. Are they actually living that?
In their everyday lives?
Yeah. That's such a good question. And a Reddit discussion really brought that up.
It did.
It's a common frustration.
Yeah. Like, the way that inflation is measured officially involves this very specific basket of goods and services.
Right.
And that basket might not actually match up perfectly with your individual spending habits.
Totally.
Or the things that you're seeing.
Or the price increases that I'm noticing the most.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, like, if you're seeing huge jumps in the price of, I don't know, like gas or groceries or rent.
Yeah, the things I actually have to pay for.
Right, the things that you're actually buying.
Yeah.
It's natural to kind of look at that overall inflation rate and be like, wait a second.
Yeah, this doesn't feel right.
This doesn't feel right.
This doesn't add up.
Yeah.
And that word gaslighting came up again on the Reddit thread.
Interesting.
And one person actually said...
What'd they say?
That it's like a key tool that the Fed uses
wow.
right along with interest rates.
Okay.
So it really underscores this feeling
of a disconnect between like the official narrative and what people are experiencing.
I think what's striking about that is that it suggests this feeling of like intentional manipulation, you know, and when people feel like they're being deliberately misled, it really damages confidence in the institution.
Yeah.
And when communication is all about you know, managing expectations. That lack of trust makes that job so much harder.
So much harder.
They're the Fed.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And look at some of the different views on inflation itself.
Okay.
We heard Richmond Fed President Barkin say that we've been through, quote, a significant inflationary period, end quote.
Okay.
That felt to me like a more direct statement than we've heard from some other people.
Yeah, I think it signals that he's recognizing the challenges that we've been through.
That we've been facing. Yeah. And it's interesting to compare that with what former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers said. Yeah. He described the current situation as the Fed facing, quote, its most difficult challenge, end quote.
Wow.
Because of the combination of high prices and a tight labor market.
Right. So that kind of paints this picture of really complex economic situation.
A lot of different factors at play.
Absolutely.
And Barkin also seemed to kind of distance himself from Chairman Powell's earlier transitory inflation comment.
Right.
And he said that he wouldn't have assumed that inflation would be a one-time event.
So that suggests that there were different opinions, even within the Fed, about how persistent inflation would be.
Right, and like how long it was going to stick around.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Barkin's later statement really kind of shows a recognition that the inflationary pressures were a lot more entrenched than some people initially anticipated.
Than they originally thought.
It's there. Okay, so now I want to bring in this perspective from the Crypto KC YouTube video.
Oh, yeah.
This is where we get a much broader critique of the Federal Reserve itself.
As an institution.
As an institution.
Yeah.
So what were some of the key things that stood out to you?
So the view in that video is like really fundamental in its criticism.
Yeah.
It argues that the whole Federal Reserve System is just inherently flawed.
Okay.
It's suggesting that it was designed to benefit like financial institutions and politically connected people rather than like the average person.
Interesting.
And the main argument is about the Fed's power to create money.
Right.
Which the video says like disproportionately benefits those select groups first.
Okay.
And that leads to things like wealth inequality and asset bubbles without actually helping out the average consumer.
Right.
So like their economic well-being.
Right. Like, is the Fed actually serving everyday people?
Right. Is it actually doing what it's supposed to do?
And so what they're suggesting in the video is pretty radical.
It is.
They're saying, get rid of the Fed.
Dismantle the whole thing.
Dismantle it. Wow. Completely. That is a radical idea.
It is a huge change.
And it's a big departure from what most economists think.
From mainstream economics.
Yeah. But it does show this like really deep skepticism about the role of central banking.
Yeah.
And it's a feeling that resonates with a lot of people.
For sure.
They feel like the current system is not working for them. It's not helping them out.
Okay, so one last thing I want to touch on.
Yeah.
Lawrence Summers also talked about tariffs.
Okay.
And how they play a role in all of this.
Yeah.
And he said that these ongoing trade disputes, especially the tariffs that were started under President Trump, are contributing to these economic challenges.
Right.
So for our listener out there, how do tariffs affect the inflation picture?
Well, if we look at just the direct impact on prices, tariffs are basically like a tax on imported goods.
Okay.
So businesses that rely on those imports might have to eat those costs or pass them on to you, the consumer, in the form of higher prices.
Higher prices for stuff.
Exactly. And Summers' argument is basically that these trade policies have just made the problem even more complicated.
Like another layer of complexity.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like another thing the Fed has to deal with.
Yeah, they've got enough on their plate as it is.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so to bring this all together, we've got the Federal Reserve using really specific language like loosened, not de-anchored. And they're trying to describe inflation expectations.
But at the same time, we're hearing skepticism from experts like Craig Shapiro who are saying like, this is gaslighting.
Right.
And we've got people on Reddit who are like, my lived experience doesn't match up with these numbers.
Exactly.
It's a really interesting.
It is. And I think you hit the nail on the head. The big takeaway here is trust in the Fed.
Trust.
It's so important.
Yeah.
Their ability to actually manage expectations is completely dependent on whether the public
believes in them.
Thinks they're competent and honest.
That they're being straight with us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, even just the perception of dishonesty
or
like miscommunication can actually make inflation worse.
Wow.
And create instability.
It all comes down to trust.
It all comes down to trust.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember
that there are a lot of different perspectives on the economy right now.
Yeah.
And the Fed's role in it.
Absolutely. Ranging from like tweaking things.
Yeah. Just like small adjustments to like.
I blew it all up.
Let's start over.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some really big ideas out there.
Yeah. This has been a really interesting deep dive.
It has been fascinating.
Yeah.
We've looked at all these different angles and opinions about the Fed and inflation. And hopefully this has given you a better understanding of what people are talking about and why it matters.
It's so relevant to everyone's lives.
It is.
And I think it highlights that like, communication from these big economic institutions isn't just about like, technical terms.
Right.
It has a real impact on how the public sees things and in the end, how they behave.
So as you're thinking about
everything that we talked about today, here's something to consider.
Okay.
How does the specific language that these institutions use, like the Federal Reserve, shape your understanding of the economy? And what are the things that make you trust or distrust the information that they're giving you?
It's a great question.
It's something to really think about.
It is.
As we're all trying to figure out what's going on.
How to navigate this landscape.
In this crazy economic world.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much.